Okay, hello and welcome to the first rig rundown video. You may have seen I've done these before live, filming a performance, speaking to the artists about what they're using, how they're approaching this for that particular performance. And I thought it'd be nice to do a more long form series of conversations with people, and who better than Chris Meyer for the first one. How are you, Chris?
I'm doing great. Winter has finally arrived to the southwestern U.S. We got well below freezing last night, but my studio is always cozy with this beast going.
I'm going to say it's a nice towering system, less cluttered than mine. The kind of mess. You keep a nicer arrangement than me. I will say for everyone early on, we're recording voices at source, so we're not having to rely on the Google audio stream. So this will go offline, but only for a few days before I put a video back up. We'll mix in some decent audio. So if you miss this or you want to refer back, it will be online, but it will disappear for a couple of days. So Chris, for those that don't know who you are, I'm sure many do. Very briefly, I guess, what's your kind of history with synths?
Yeah, I got interested in the modular, well, in synths in general in the 70s, when I was a teenager, actually. I just fell in love with the sound of them, and I was already into electronics at the time, getting into music. So it was inevitable that once I heard there was this thing called electronic music, I had to get into it. So in addition to taking keyboard and bass lessons, I found a local guy who's actually the local area rep for Steiner Parker, and I started taking synthesizer lessons as a teenager on a modular system, a Steiner Parker modular. And I just have been used to the idea of having a modular system with me. I had one through college. I was lucky enough to go work for Sequential Circuits for a few years and design some of the instruments like the Prophet VS. I used a ragtag modular system to design the voice that became vector synthesis. So I was very involved in using these guys for a while. But then I switched careers a while back, got into video and film, and music kind of fell dormant for a while. Then fortunately, some friends started asking me to come out and start jamming with them, and I started dragging more equipment like filter banks and things like that to go play with them. And this got the interest in me, like, when I slow back down in life, I want to get back into having a nice, large personal modular as my playpen, as my time off, as my chance to relax. And after a year or two of planning, this is kind of where we've ended up.
I'm just looking, I don't want to dwell kind of into the past with this thing. I want to get into this rig and quickly run it down, but I don't think I've actually seen a Steiner system. So I'm pulling images up. Is this the kind of thing, or is that too early, too late?
Well, it was called a synthesis system, and I'm watching the delay patch here, so it'll come up here in a second.
Okay, the Steiner synthesis system. Because I've heard of the Steiner things, and obviously Steiner Parker filters by Livewire, and Manhattan Analog's currently working on one.
So it's kind of similar to the black units, except for they were originally silver. And yeah, they were that format type of machine. They were using the 3.5 millimeter jacks like we're used to now in Eurorack systems. And they had a nice sound to them. I always, for some reason, associate triangle waves with them because they had a nice sparkly sound. Their filters tended to be two-pole, etc. Nice sequencers built in. Portable keyboard from the earliest days. And it was a nice flexible system to learn on.
Okay, West Coast-ish in nature, or East Coast style, or its own thing entirely?
It was very East Coast. It's your typical subtractive synthesis approach. And I have to admit, that was my background. That's what I learned early on, was all subtractive synthesis. I was very East Coast starting out. But when I got back into stuff a few years ago, I've really gotten into the West Coast approach as well. And I've had the good fortune to having met and worked a little bit with Don Buchla back in the day, and friends with Serge now. And it's fun to combine them. So I have like a bank of wave shapers and wave folders, and I have lots of low pass gates, and I just combine that with my East Coast voices these days. I don't have a strong philosophy. For me, it's all about sound exploration.
Okay, so that's maybe an interesting starting point for the system. You said it's in kind of, you've got a bank of shapers, bank of filters. Is it very much kind of toolbox style? Here are my generators that come down into the processing row, and modulation patches up or down. And
yeah, I'm half German. I'm an engineer. I'm a Virgo. I've worked for Japanese companies. By nature and nurture, I'm a very meticulous, organized person, although you couldn't tell from the mess of the rest of the studio you can't see right now. So I'm very much into, let's have a logical layout. So I just go to a section, and I know what I'm looking for is somewhere in that section, and then I can pick among the different choices that I have. And I really try to build a machine that wasn't based around the idea of building a voice, but based around possibilities, having one of each, having a wide variety of modules, and then having what I would think personally would be my personal favorites or best of class in each one. So the general flow of the system is that the sequencer section's up here, the clocking section's in here in the middle, including with logic underneath, the percussion section's over here, including a couple algorithmic rhythm generators, then VCOs, VCFs. In the middle, these are various wave shaper devices, including an FM Age, Super Sautor, a couple wave folders, a ring mod, etc. Mostly low-pass gates and VCAs. And then in the middle of the system are mixers, including a variety of different mixers with different sounds to bring everything together. Low-gain submix is pretty much the core of my system, but I've got Moog CB3 type mixer. I've got actually voltage-controlled crossfader. I've got a Steiner backdual filter, because he had independent inputs for low pass, high pass, band pass, not the outputs, but independent inputs. So you can do some frequency layering by bringing one sound to the low pass, a different sound to the high pass, and then use the cutoff knob to blend in between them. Yeah,
I've seen that on a couple of people. I think Blue Lanterns incorporated that idea on, I think, a Polyvox style backend. I know Rob Hordak does that on his systems as well. I'll pull up, just as we're talking, the Modular Grid. When you're watching back on YouTube, we'll put the link in the description for this for people to check out. I know you're going to try and keep this up to date, Chris, as inevitable changes happen.
That's my goal, because I do change the system quite a bit. Actually, I changed it again Friday, because I just got in a brand new AD generator. I got an Rajastone's radar in. So I bumped out the IntelliGel Quadra to my traveling rig. I'm using that now in the system to play around with. And just trying to complete the system. Underneath the VCAs, mixers, and VCFs are the modulators. A lot of random sources in addition to a lot of ADs and a lot of different envelopes. And the very bottom end is audio I/O and effects devices. And there's a few gaps in it right now because I'm waiting on a few modules to come in. Like there's some new stuff from AJH Synth, his 12-pole phase shifter, and a nice finishing module that are going to go in the bottom row of this to help augment my system.
Yeah, I got to hear those again yesterday at Ross Lamon's Bells and Whistles, Crackles and Pops event. Alan from AGH came up. That phaser's gorgeous. It really, really is. You can, and being it, there's a cool trick with that for anyone watching that doesn't know. You can tap the feedback from any pole that doesn't have to be the one you're listening to. So you can set up a 10-pole or 12-pole phaser, but tap the feedback from pole 5 or 3 or 7. And each pole through this phasing inverts. So all the even numbers are standard, all the odd numbers are inverted. So tapping the resonance at different points means you can go through the kind of krautrock phaser, the Hable phaser, the small stone style phasing. Really, really nice device. Looking at the system, again, I'll pull up the image rather than people looking at my head. So do you find that everything being spread out in terms of, here's, this corner is sequencing, this is percussion, that helps kind of nurture this, to use Mate Noise's terminology, the kind of no-coast approach? You reach for a sound generator, you don't necessarily reach to a voice of a particular style.
Yeah, I'm not reaching for a voice, I'm reaching for and now I need a general class of a module. And then I look at what I've got available and say, well, what do I want to try to use on this patch? So it's not like planning ahead of time, I want to recreate a mini Moog voice, I want to recreate a Buchla Music Easel voice. It's just I start putting together patches and saying, okay, oscillators, are we going to go analog or digital today to play around? And again, I've kind of broken things out to where I have an analog row in through here, and then a digital row down through here, just again, so I can have a mental break of what the different types of modules I have are. And I almost always layer things. So even in this patch, I've got a Spectrum going, which is the main voice, but I also have a Livewire AFG in my particular patch going right now, just to add some more bass and thump to things.
Yeah, very nice. I'll interject. People in the chat room, completely fire away with anything you want to ask for questions. GHFHGHF asked, what was the mixer at the center of the system? I pull this up on screen. This is the low gain submix.
Yeah, it's very flexible in terms of having 4 banks of 3-to-1 mixers, but then it has lots of gained submixes of those sets. And it's a very clean mixer. He's very proud of his mix bus in there, so there's no phase cancellation. So it's like my clean go-to mixer because there's so many inputs available and it's clean. But it's flanked on either side by things that are off the normal base of being a mixer. To the left is a Student Guy CP3-based mixer, but also the AGH Synth Ring SM is a 5-input CP3 type mixer as well. So I've got the Moog type mixers on the left, and then on the right I've got crossfaders. I've got just a simple Dofer voltage control crossfader, and also then the Steiner filter to do some frequency-based mixing.
Yeah. Well, looking at the submix, and again, I've spoken to Logan about his kind of mix circuit. Very proud and a very good mix circuit. Feel free to go ask Logan Erickson from Loggain about his mixer and tell him me and Chris sent you. Don't pester him though. Be nice. Don't say we sent you. You're gonna pester the guy. But I mean, looking at the mixer, it allows you to do, well, it could be quadraphonic in terms of the A, B, C, D outputs, and it could be stereo, it could be any mix of things. I think banks, I'm really interested in banks of a lot of one thing. As you mentioned, radar for erogenous tones, or the levitate, or banks of quad VCAs. I really like the kind of toolbox mentality of that. When you get into the mindset of, I need a new envelope, right, I'll just get 4, and then that's going to see me for a while. So
let's talk about envelopes for a while, because I did have everything. There's a reason for every module in here. Everything's pretty well thought out, and I even kind of broke down my approach to envelopes to 2 different sets. On the one hand, I wanted really, really flexible multi-stage or ADSR type envelopes that would give me complex shapes and really allow me to dial in the sounds. So for that perspective, that's why I had the WMD multimode envelope. It's the most flexible envelope generator I've found in terms of letting me dial in the exact shape of each part of the envelope and having multiple stages, voltage controlled, end of stage triggers, etc. And I also have the verbose multi-envelope as well, which is very flexible, multiple outputs at the same time, different delay stages, voltage control over everything. And I've just got a couple Lattics I'm playing around with now because they're give me some different possibilities, including the one with the initial level ADSR. So I've got envelopes for when I really want to custom carve a sound and get a very specific approach. But then in addition to that, I have my utility envelopes for when I want to blip a wave folder, when I just need to blip a filter open, when I just need to do a quick little simple AD something on another part of the patch. That's why I had an IntelliGel Quadra for a while, and then I just put the radar in.
Yeah, let's go through those envelopes. I'll pull these up. The WMD MME multimode envelope is definitely a personal favorite of mine. So on its own, this is the module. You have a shape stage over attack, which goes from kind of more than exponential, I think. They're kind of hyper extended shapes, logarithmic or reverse exponential, through linear to exponential on the attack, and then there's the rate for the attack. Same for decay. Sustain level is just a sustain level, but there's then the modes to the side. You can do things like attack, decay, sustain, attack, release, cycle in, AD envelopes, AR envelopes, standard ADSRs. It's fantastic. I tend to use the inverted output a lot and the bipolar out to kind of create an LFO as well. Do you tend to get any use out of those?
I do them occasionally because I find that when I use high-pass filters in particular, I tend to invert the envelope so that the initial onset of a note brings in a bass pulse, lowers the cutoff of the filter, and lets lots of frequencies through. And then as the note decays, I'll let it go to a bright sound. I'm using a high-pass filter because I want a bright sound in the first place, but I still like a thump, the idea of a key thump on the attack. So I'll use an inverted envelope just to reach down, grab some of those bass frequencies, then come up to being a high-pass filter for the sustain part.
Yeah, exactly that. And things for me, when it's like a looping AR or AD, just standard 2-stage triangle ramp style LFOs, just having the bipolar version works really well, rather than having to think about re-offsetting that. There is an expander for this one, if I can find it.
Yeah, I make a habit of getting the expander for every module that I get because I want all the features. Because the idea of this is it's supposed to be a sound lab, so I want all the possibilities.
Yeah, I like the term sound lab. That's a nice approach. Here's the expander for people. So this then offers CV input with a 10U version for attack, decay, sustain, release. You get an end of every stage: attack, end of decay, end of sustain, end of release. You've got an ADR timescale CV input to affect all the time-based stages. There's a retrigger input, a hold input, and you can change the reset behavior on a new gate while the envelope's still going. Really, really cool.
And you brought up a really good point about the shapes, the exponential shapes. Like, for example, just because you have an exponential envelope does not mean they're all going to perform the same. Because if you had a true exponential decay, it would never go to silence. The mathematical definition of exponential is it never goes all the way down. So each person who designs an envelope generator has to decide where to cut off that exponential phase, so you're not waiting forever for it to hit the top level or the bottom level. So like the Roland 540 takes a lot of that exponential and takes forever to get down to the sustain level. On the other hand, the verbose really truncates it very quickly as you come down to the sustain level. The idea behind the new student tie guy envelope is that they really tried to emulate the behavior of the early Moog envelopes and where they truncated the exponential attack. So even if you got a bunch of exponential ADSRs, they're all going to have different shapes because the designers made different decisions on where to cut off that exponential shape and say, we've now hit the highest part, we've now hit the lowest part of our envelope.
Yeah, that way, that thinking about that, I not really approached it until meeting Dieter Doepfer at Superbooth a year and a half-ish ago, the first Superbooth in Berlin. And he just brought out the new high-end VCO, and it had linear control. He was saying you can actually stop the VCO entirely. It won't just get slower and slower and slower, it will stop. But you can only do that with linear control, because exponential, as you said, will never reach zero in a true mechanical sense. While we're talking about envelopes, Gregory Pruden in the chat has asked, why did you move the Quadra to the traveling system?
Because I kept killing it. I had the Quadra and its expander in my main machine here, but the Quadra was so flexible for utility envelopes, I kept taking out the main unit and putting it in my travel system whenever I went on the road. This meant undoing and redoing a bunch of jumpers for the expander, then redoing all the jumpers, putting it back together in my system. Well, I finally got the jumpers wrong, turned on power, great amounts of smoke came out. It took a week to get the smoke out of the studio. And I said, okay, I think I'm being told something here. So I got the Quadra repaired, and I was just going to live in my travel system, so I'm not swapping it in and out all the time. And then I had to replace it with something. So I went on a hunt for a solution for 3, 4, 6, 8 different just simple ADs or ARs for when I need to pluck something like a wave folder. And I eventually landed on the radar because, among other things, like some really cool quadrature modes, octal modes, he has very flexible envelope shapes in terms of continuous control over whether it's linear or exponential, and also whether your attack is a true exponential attack or a log attack like many of us are used to hearing. So, I research each module and say what's going to be, for my tastes and for my applications, what's the best in class for that part of my system, and then that's what I go by.
That's a good point about logarithmic shapes. It tends to be that we get the log attack, and then it's the decay and the release that are exponential. Not many envelopes give you options over that. I don't know much about the radar, so selfishly, let's pull that up and have a quick look at that.
It's huge, but it's very, very flexible. Well,
they play into, as I said, I like this idea of, I need an envelope, I'll get a bank of 8 of them. It does. I mean, my first thought as well was that it was big, and I also thought the gaps between the knobs is quite big. And as many users do, can this not be smaller? So I guess, is it very playable in terms of having the size? Or, I mean, for 8 envelopes, it's not really that big.
It just went into the system Friday, so I'm just getting used to it, and it's not overly large. Some of the spacings for the switches and the knobs are actually a little tight for someone who does not have petite fingers, and I don't qualify for that. But it was Rick Burnett's idea of having streams of 8 going across the system. That's why his gate storm has 8 gate outputs. That's why he wanted to have 8 envelopes. He has a octal VCA, and the idea of his levitate, the 8 in mixer, was then to mix all those. So he really saw 8 signals flowing through his particular modules. And that was his aesthetic.
Yeah. No, I can really appreciate that. And again, I'm not trying to get rid of people's time here, but Rick's someone that I've spoken to in the past, and if anyone has any questions, I'm sure he'd be happy to delve into that. Most people are very approachable, whoever you are, me and Chris pestering people, or just using asking questions. I have the gate storm, which is fantastic, so I do kind of appreciate this idea of running things through. I like using gates for modulation over drums. I had the gate storm, every output plugged into the SSF entity at one point. It worked great. If you were very careful over the programming, it did work fantastic, but having levitate to scale all that back, or envelopes to trigger, would be much more handy. So these are appealing. I wanted to ask about the multi envelope as well from Verbos.
Yes.
What are you, in terms of kind of musical approach, how are you seeing all these as different? I mean, you've said, you know, this is a toolbox, this is a kind of sound design machine for you to explore. But do you find yourself reaching, say for the multi-envelope that looks very different to the WMD, is there certain things that you reach for each of them, or is it still very exploratory in approach?
I reach for the WMD multimode envelope if I really care, if I have very slow attacks or very slow decays or releases, and I'm really wanting to finesse the shapes. So when I have sounds where you're really wanting to hear the evolution of the sound, that's when I really go for the WMD. On the other hand, if I'm really going for pluck type sounds, I find myself going for the Verbos much more often, because it's set up to have all sorts of different hold stages or delay stages. Different envelope outputs are all available simultaneously, and he has a continuous shape control also from linear through log exponential. And both of them actually have end of stage trigger outs of voltage control. So I do kind of mentally break down, like, am I doing something languid where I really want to study the evolution of a sound? Then it's definitely the WMD I go for. Am I trying to pluck the filter, but I still want a sustain level, and then I want to decay after I let go of the note? That's when I have the multi-envelope in the patch, as opposed to just a simple AD or an AR.
That's interesting. Greg Gibbons, Phlegosaurus Rex tends to be his username from Modular Podcast. He uses the WMD for the same thing, long kind of evolving envelopes where something in his drum sequence might trigger it and it takes 8 bars to expand and pull back down again. I tend to use the MME, the WMD one, for the short plucked stuff. I think I'm the only one that does.
Well, it actually has some great modes, like its attack, decay, attack is perfect for getting that horn blip double attack, for example.
Yes, Spotsando, I think the technique's called, I forget. My brass playing friends will come and kick me for that. I know what you mean. The attack, instant duck and crescendo, it does that very well. But the fact it will go kind of hyper exponential in the decay and release, I find it perfect for pitch envelopes on drums if I'm making up my own kicks or toms or snares. Quantum Space has asked, again, I'm pulling in questions, so people in the chat, feel free to ask. I'll ask when it feels right. Do you have the blip expander for the rear?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do have the blip. I have not gotten into the blip yet, but I did get it because I wanted to see what was going on with it. It's funny talking to Rick Burnett about radar. He really sees the radar as being a compact design where he had to cut stuff out. And he wanted to put all the additional things he was thinking about, including even presets, in the blip expander.
Guido says, hello Guido, by the way. Questions about blip, saying that it's great. You can select what CV inputs do, set random modes, and change other settings on radar. I know nothing about the blip. Looks like a good manual, though, in terms of being able to get some ideas of what is going on. Is it CV inputs? I mean, very vaguely, I understand you've only had it since Friday.
Yeah.
CV input, is it only 2 inputs, or?
Well, there's only one master CV input on the blip, so it's more like a macro adjustment is the vibe I'm getting from it. But it sounds like Guido's had a chance to use it more than I have at this point.
Blip doesn't do anything, just the settings for radar.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not a standalone.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But I wondered if it had, you know, the inputs and outputs on there. It doesn't look to have. It looks more of a controller that just reroutes the inputs on radar itself. And
I have to say, in general, I like modules that have breakout possibilities. I really like it when the manufacturer puts on the back a pin header with additional controls that I can reach. Like on my triple VCF, my Doper A127, I've made a panel to switch me between band pass and low pass. I've got a bunch of little pequeño interrupters, tiny interrupter switches coming for all my Lattic modules, because he's put so much stuff on the back that you can bring around and change how the delay behaves, stuff like that. I have an original Oberheim 2 voice, and what Tom Oberheim did with the original SEM module is he put all these different ins and outs and parameters on Molex pins on the back. So I drilled holes down the left and right side of my SEM modules and brought everything that was on a Molex connector out to a jack along the left and right sides, and basically turned it into a semi-modular modular as opposed to just being a pre-configured voice. And I just love it when manufacturers give us the ability to expand the modules in that way.
Yeah, my most recent one with that is I met him again yesterday at Ross Lamon's Bells and Whistles event. Vladimir Pultek, Vlad from VPME that makes Euclidean circles. He just has a module called 6 switches, and they're just output mutes for the 6 Euclidean outputs. And it's great. There's a performative tool, just have a switch to just go you stop and just flick it. It saves having to have a mixer that's got mutes on to then mute the audio path further downstream to actually stop the gates. Works really well. And if there's effects involved as well, if I've got a voice running on this Euclidean circles rhythm and I just mute the audio, then obviously it's going to cut reverb tails and delays and anything else depending on the patch. To actually mute the information at the start, I find more useful.
Yeah, I think things like that are thinking people had ages ago and we kind of lost and people gotten back to. Like one of the dinosaurs in my system is this box. It's a custom built cabinet by Carl Fravel of Gentle Electric. He built it back in the 70s. It's mainly a dozen VCAs and other voltage control processors, but he put mute switches with LED confirmation on every one of the VCA outputs. So if I have a note sustaining, I can mute every individual voice going through the VCAs in this guy. And that was thinking back in the 70s when people were building custom equipment. I'm glad people are bringing that performability back into the modules today.
Yeah, here is that system for anyone curious. I mean, it looks like a massive amount of stuff in terms of mults, mixing, VCAs, attenuation.
Yeah, it's a great processor. It has lots of different mixers, including inversion. Plus 10-volt biases are normal to the inputs on all those. He's got voltage-controlled attenuators for processing control voltages, tons of VCAs, lots of ways of mixing the VCAs, mutes for the VCAs. He has intelligent summers that will actually cut the level down as you plug in multiple signals so you don't overdrive something. So it's amazingly well thought of back in the day, but it's based on the old 70s Aries synthesizer. There's a whole bunch of 3080 chips in the back, and these old VCA designs only have about 70 dB signal to noise. But it still has linear exponential switch on all of them. It has a gain and an overdrive control on most of the VCAs. It's been a massively useful cabinet. And despite being so old, I've only had to recap the power supply and spin it so far.
I've got the image of the back of it up.
Yeah, isn't that scary?
Yeah. It's great. Yeah, unlike you wouldn't want to put your hand in. But yeah,
no, you don't. It's the power supply is like unshielded and all this. It's really terrible.
Yeah. But it's interesting that's still there in your system. We were just talking about this before we went live. That would you buy this today? And you said, well, I'd have to replace it because I use all these VCAs. You said the signal to noise is 70 dB, which is nowhere near most of the stuff now, but why do you tend to reach for this as an older bank of things over the VCAs you've got in a system? Is it simply that you need more and you have it, or does this offer something that they don't?
When I need more, I reach for it. Okay. Now today, just as a challenge putting together the patch for today's sound, I said, let's use it as a main VCA just for fun. And I remembered it has a really nice overdrive characteristic. Now normally if I want a clean VCA, I have a Happy Nerdy 3X VCA, which is very flexible with inversion on the control voltage inputs. It's a great panner as well. And I have the Roland 530, which has audio input mixers and CV input mixers. So those tend to be the VCAs I go for first building a patch, because I know what they do. They're clean. They're very easy to control. I got a WMD multimode VCA just because I wanted something crazy. I wanted something that had every possibility of what a VCA could do. But when I start saying I need a CV stuff, when I want to start enveloping modulation depths to FMing oscillators and FMing filters and things like that, I need more VCAs, and I go for now this big system when I need more VCAs. And indeed, when I first started putting together this modular system, this was going to be the core. I was going to rearrange it so the modules were horizontal, and then build a case around that, and make that was the equivalent of now my mixer core in this system. I got talked out of that madness, and also because you see what the wiring's like in the back of it. I can't imagine having to rewire the back of this thing. And then the folks at ADAC came out with this very reasonable monster frame that I had shipped over from Portugal. And it ended up being the right size, the right ergonomics. And I just said, this is my sandbox. If something comes in, something's got to go out. But this is my system, and it makes me really focus on what modules I buy. I'm not just accumulating things because they're cool. I'm like, well, do you like that better than something you already have? Because something's got to go. And it really focuses me on my decisions when I add something into here.
Yeah. I'll pull the image of the case up. That may be well, I imagine that would definitely be a question if we didn't bring it up. The ADAC monster frame, you said. So what did you do for power? We won't get too heavy on power, but just, currently what are you using? Or because this comes unpowered, right?
No, it comes powered. He originally sold it with just 5 amps for plus 12 and minus 12, and there's no way you can fill this with modules and stay under 5 amps. So I ordered mine with 10 amps, but they forgot to install the bigger power supply when they shipped it to me. So he had to send me a brand new set of regulator boards and switcher power supplies and wiring harness for the inside of it, and one instruction was wrong. So when I powered it up, boom, the magic smoke was released. And you use every crisis as an opportunity. I use that crisis to put in larger switching power supplies that basically doubled the capacity. If I'm willing to make the regulators get hot, I can probably deliver 12, maybe even 15 amps on a power supply rail in this guy. If you look at Modular Grid, this system is taking less than 7 amps. So I know I have lots of headroom. I'm a big headroom guy, so I feel very comfortable with the system.
Yeah, cool. I'll pull questions in kind of randomly. The envelope ones were obviously on topic, but Peter in the chat room has asked, can you do true polyphony, polyphonic playing or sequencing on that? I guess the immediate answer is yes. You could easily set up a few voices.
Yeah. Where's Mark Doty when you need to talk about polyphony? I can definitely do multiple voices, and that was one of my criteria when I was configuring the system, is I wanted to do at least 4 voices at once, because I like to do a lot of stuff with layered sequences, etc., or layered sequences and a keyboard line. And I do have a long-term vision of taking this out and playing it live. So it had to be able to be my live system. So yes, it can do multiple voices at once, but can it do chords and have each note be exactly the same sound? No, because I put variety as my highest priority. So rather than having 3 or 4 of one particular oscillator, I've chosen VCOs that are purposely different from each other. Like even down in digital wavetable oscillators, I've got the latest synth technology E352 Cloud Terrarium, and I have the Waldorf NW1, in addition to having a braid because it's so versatile. And the reason is because when I think of sounds, I really visualize metals quite a bit. Are they shiny? Are they rough? What type of metal or wood or what material? For me, the synthesis technology sound is that nice, really brushed metal. It's just a lovely gleaming sound. Whereas I'm a fan of the old PBG. It was an inspiration for the Prophet VS. And for me, that's a piece of really jagged steel that's maybe corroding a little bit. So each of these modules bring a picture to my mind of what they sound like. And I chose ones that had different pictures, different sounds, rather than saying, oh, let me buy 3 or 4 of this so I can make a chord out of it. Excuse me.
I'm very much the same. I do have, multiple of some oscillators, not so much a full voice. I don't have, even at the very basic core of a voice, the same VCO into VCF with one envelope and say one LFO and a VCA X amount of times over for the voices of the polyphony. I much prefer that method for modular. The idea that modular can't do polyphony is obviously a size and HP and price restriction. But I love that idea, and in terms of musical approach, I really like thinking about the root note, the thing that is going to mirror, in a more traditional song sense, if I have a bass line and effectively chords on top, that octave above that bass is usually where I want to be grittiest. I've got, you know, big bass that's got maybe some shaping, maybe kind of West Coast, folder, kind of distortion, then a filter. I kind of like coupling those up in the low end. But then, you know, the root note in that chord is probably the grittiest point I want to hit. Because I like my chords kind of just one octave above the bass. I don't like getting too high above. So that might be an oscillator and a folder. But then voice 2 and 3 might be basic analog oscillators into low pass filters. And then voice 4 might be some entirely kind of unrelated musical line that tinkles above but occasionally hits certain chord tones and suggests maybe extensions in the chords. It's much more interesting, I think, that way. And I think we hear it differently. You know, think about an orchestra, it's not the same instrument, or it's not all strings, just different sized strings to create different pitches. It's much,
yeah, I mean, you do have a string section, but you do have all these different instruments in the brass section, all these different instruments in the wooden section.
Yeah.
And my own aesthetic for this beast is there's a couple of personal philosophies in music making. Is I like the few monophonic lines that are very detailed and that you study and that you listen to. So that's my own personal preference in music that I listen to and compose, as opposed to playing chords and things like that. I wanted things that, like the band I played in for a while, Cosmic Debris, was like a bass player, a flute player, and the monophonic synthesis was a large part of the sound and me doing rhythm stuff. So I really like the aesthetic of the old, you know, quartet almost, where you have these very distinct voices and they're very interesting and you're following those lines, as opposed to the idea of chord comping. Nothing against chord comping. My wife right now is down listening to the New Mexico Philharmonic doing a classical piano concert because we like grand piano and all that as well. But this was my own aesthetic. And also I love layered things. I'm really quite an Ableton Live user. So I really layer percussion parts to get a lot of polyrhythms going. And that's my approach with sequencing as well, as I like to start layering all these different counterpoints.
Yeah, I'm the same. People that have watched my content before will know that I teach music through the week. That's the day job, either instruments or as a lecturer of music. And kind of string quartet writing 101 is do not just get a keyboard and play 4 chords and expect 4 instruments to just block through the chord changes in the track. As you write independent lines that land on chord tones as they kind of interweave, and at some certain point you will hear the chord tone, but lines move and meander. That's definitely my musical approach to polyphonic patching. And I like lines that disappear. I like hearing 2 or 3 sequences at once, and then maybe every 4 bars something flutters in and suggests some additional harmony and disappears again.
Yeah,
I really like that way of working. For me on synths, I find that more interesting.
And that's my approach. That's why I have a modular, is to do that. Now I do have, you know, a couple other keyboards like a JD800 and a Prophet VS for when I do want to do chord work and stuff like that. But again, this was just a very focused thing of, this was my playpen to say, I really want to focus on sound and creating new sounds. Like I had an interesting conversation recently with someone about filters. Is I just put up a bunch of videos of the Doepfer XP filter, which is based on the Curtis chip. I no longer have that filter because it sounds exactly like a synth. And I wanted something that sounded unlike all the other instruments that were currently available. Now, was again, my pursuit of modular was not to create a mini Moog or an ARP Odyssey or something like that. It was to come up with sounds you can't do with those instruments. So again, that guides my module approach quite a bit of what's going to let me get outside of the box and not be just another Curtis chip, etc.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite mono synths of all, I've not touched every one by any means, but of the ones I've had is the Roland SH09. I think I would have an SH2 for the dual oscillator given the chance, but it's a really basic synth. 1 oscillator, a divided square subwave, filter, 1 envelope, 1 LFO, really simple. And because of that, I've kind of avoided doing that in modular. I've no real interest in a Roland style filter and oscillator combo because that does it. And I can play that like a mono synth and just turn it on and it does it, and it will always do it. I very much like breaking out, especially with, like you said, if you don't want a Moog style filter potentially, or a Moog style remake. I like Moog style filters on wavetable oscillators, or put a folder after a Moog style oscillator. I think that's where it starts to get more interesting.
Yeah, and that was part of the approach here when I started putting together this laboratory. I mean, I started researching this a few years ago before there were so many modules available. And it started off with a list of, I want one SEM type filter, I want one Moog type filter, I want one Steiner type filter, I want one Yamaha type filter. Just kept going down that list. And now it's impossible to have one of each because there's so many to choose from. But the Moog sound was one of those things because I grew up listening to 70s era Tangerine Dream and Klaus Schulze. So that's that particular sound that I was weaned on. So I'm very familiar with it.
Yeah.
And I have a couple of Moog-like sounding filters. Like I listened to the various shootouts of different Moog filters, and of the ones that were available at the time, I actually preferred the Doepfer A108, which in addition to being a nice transistor filter, can be up to an 8-pole filter and has 6, 12, 24, and 48 dB outs and jumpers inside to change how many poles you get. So that's a fun sounding filter. But then I really love the Rawsome Evolution filter because it's quite an update on that Moog topology and a very clean, very predictable, very solid variation on that.
Yeah. Guido's asked in the chat, because you just said you like layering in Ableton. So I'm going to come on to layering in terms of that being a kind of sonic approach soon. But Guido's asked, do you patch with Ableton in mind?
No.
Okay.
That's probably going to change next year because so far the two have been separate systems. I've been focusing on getting this up and getting more familiar with it. Next year is when I start hoping to bring those two worlds together and start driving this system from live, relying on live heavily for the percussion parts and then using this then for the monophonic line standard weave around that. Okay.
Well, let's get into the patching idea. Thinking of jumping off the back of polyphonic patching, Colin Bender's someone people should go check out live, very kind of club focused. Not necessarily commercial, but more kind of straight dance floor orientated thing on a modular, very well produced version of that on a modular as well. Does a lot of layering. So his voices, like you, Chris, won't just be one oscillator into one processor. There's dense things being pushed and shaped and nudged around. How many kind of layers do you kind of get going? What are you looking for in, if you had to put an ultimate synth voice together for your kind of no-co style, not east nor west? How many oscillators would you, for a single voice, how many oscillators would you want, and what would you want to run off the back of it?
I found with oscillators that I require a minimum of 2, and I will usually have at least 3 waveforms going at the same time. We can play around this patch a little bit because this is a good example where I've got the Spectrum, WMD, SSF, and then also the Livewire audio frequency generator. Let me go ahead and bring some stuff down out of here. And I'll get down to just simple filter stuff for now. So I've got the Spectrum, and I'm playing around with using some random LFO from the Kermit just to give some modulation to the shape of the waveform so it has a coarse voice even by itself. But I've got it going through a rectifier. Let me go ahead and reduce my release a little bit here. A rectifier in the surge clone from random source, just to give a little bit of envelope sound. Like this is just, that's a straight waveform. I go ahead and dial in a little bit of a horn sound. And then I give a little bit of an attack blip. So that'd be like one component of my voice, is to have something that has some complexity and some motion to it, some wave shaping that's enveloped, so I have some evolution, particularly in the attack. But then I want to layer a second voice. So I've got the AFG just bringing in pretty much a square wave, but I have both sides of the square wave animated, again, using, in this case, the smoothly fluctuating voltages from my Frap Tools Sapel. So some evolution in that sound. But then I bring in the sub-octave from it as well. Then mixing in the Spectrum. So for me, that's kind of like the minimum I go for. I find diminishing returns when I go past 3 VCOs on a voice, or past 4 wave shapes mainly. I don't hear a lot more when I start bringing more parts in, but that's the sort of thickness that I like. And then on the filter side, I've been playing around with doing 2 filters in parallel. So in this case, I have the evolution filter giving me my nice little nice pluck, and I could change the number of poles in this one. Make it very squelchy. Very chewy sort of sound if I want, or back this off to something that's very tight, like a super Moog. But then I've also split off the audio signal out of the mixer, and I'm running it through the Doppler 8127 triple resonant filter just to go ahead and add some more motion to the sound. So I've got LFOs going on different bandpass variations. Like a phase shifter type sound, and mix those two together. So that's one note sustained. And then when I've got a sequence going, then there's some evolution to the sequence.
I like that we've not spoke about that before. It kind of caught me off guard, but I like that you mix the kind of phaser style layering. I've done that a lot with notches, so taking several oscillators into a mixer, or two but several waveforms into maybe 3 channels, 4 channels at a push, into my main filter, but either as you have entirely parallel, so they run and then maybe into the same VCA at the end.
Yeah, because I didn't want to lose the sound of particularly the attack or the bass from the evolution filter, so I decided to go in parallel rather than series, so I could just add in some air from the phase shift type sound rather than restricting the bandwidth of everything down to the phase shifter.
Yes, yeah. The way I got around, rather than it being bands, the way I'd done it in the past was to just use a notch filter, so yeah, taking a thin element out rather than restricting down into a fill element.
That works really well. Yeah.
Yeah, and then mixing down into one. Do you tend to kind of do all the modulation and shaping, and then have you got a VCA that's quite basic in terms of its modulation at the end, or does the kind of layering and more creative routing continue past this point in terms of filters?
For the most part, I have pretty simple VCAs at the end of all that, because I've done a lot of motion on the harmonic end of it. I have played around a little bit with using things like the Verbose scan and pan to go ahead and get more motion and fade in between sounds. And that's something I want to do more experimenting with, is to get that automatic cross-fading in between different sounds. But I've personally been focusing more on changing the timbre of the sound itself. It's my approach to a sound, particularly since I do these monophonic lines, is when I hit the sustain, I don't want to lose my dance floor. I don't want people to go, oh, the note's over, we can leave now, because it's not evolving. It's really important to me that while a note's sustaining, or while I'm playing a trance-like line, like a sequence that's running, that there is this constant evolution to keep the mind interested rather than saying, oh, I've heard the sound, you got something new?
I think that's really important in terms of, well, the kind of sound design, but the kind of musicality of this stuff, that if you're going to hit a sustain stage, it shouldn't just then become all this gorgeous movement and then just for as long as the note's held. Or the same with a sequence and it just being a repetitive sequence. I tend to find one or the other is enough. So if it's going to reach a sustain and kind of bottom out for a while, I don't need to maybe modulate that envelope much because I've got a lot of sonic manipulation. Or if the sequence is static, then I'm going to need the kind of more sonic manipulation like you've done there with the triple bandpass. I need something that flows over something static and repetitive. Just as we're still taking questions, Paul Rowbury, sorry if I've said your name wrong, Paul, in the chat asks, now that he's seen you playing the keyboard, can you discuss your CV and MIDI bridging, just your interfacing?
Yeah, even though part of the idea of having a nice ergonomic modular is you can go ahead and reach for controls and adjust this while things are going, I still like having a lot of my adjustments at my keyboard while I am playing. So it was important to me to come up with a system where I could derive a lot of control voltages from my playing interface and use that to drive modules. This patch I didn't have time set up too much, but I'm using a Core tactile keyboard, mainly because it's got an XY keypad in addition to triggers, in addition to sliders, in addition to knobs, as well as the normal pitch and mod wheel. And I have that running to an Expert Sleeper's FH1 with a pair of expanders. So I'm getting 3x8 or 24 different gates or control voltages off of the keyboard with these knobs and sliders that I can now use to manipulate sounds while they're playing. So having the options to do that evolution underneath my hand, not just automatically from LFOs and such, is also a real priority for me. And the way that I've been routing the system is I've been trying to, it's the old, what's the best in class? How do I get those voltages out to everybody? And what I've settled on currently is I've been using a Frap Tools 333 as one of my main buffered mults because it has a 3-input mixer going into 3 copied outputs and it has 3 of those sections. So in this case, I've got the sequencer and the keyboard going to the same one. So I can transpose if I want while I'm playing it because I'm summing those voltages together with the Frap. And then if I have an oscillator that tracks particularly well, I'll just patch straight to that. A lot of analog oscillators don't track particularly well, and I like to be able to play over a few octaves. So I have a whole row of AGH V scales that allow me to custom trim in the tracking of each of my oscillators so I can get them to stay in tune for these big layered sounds across the keyboard. I mean, I like motion to a sound, but I don't like out of tune stuff that much. I like a predictable amount of detune that I have control over, as opposed to saying, oh, isn't it great? It's analog. No, it's out of tune. And so I've been focusing on that, and particularly when I'm doing FM, because I've really been getting into complex oscillators and dual oscillators and doing FM patches, and you just have to have your oscillators track perfectly for that patch to hold up over a couple octaves. And that's why I've really been, it's important to me as part of my keyboard setup to have these V scales so I can really tweak the tuning of my oscillators and get a complex voice to track for a few octaves.
Yeah, I'd like to just bring up the Frap Tools 333 as something that's seemingly, well, I don't think it's boring, but it's one of the things of, oh, buffer multi is boring, a basic switch is boring, it's a utility. I kind of hate that, and this is a discussion I've had with Logan at Login, that the word utility is almost a dirty word. Like, oh, it's not exciting, that's just a utility. That's, for me, that's what modular is. That's the best part, that these utilities allow the modulation and the interactions to happen.
Utilities are a huge part of my system.
Yeah.
Logan Submix was the second module I bought because I wanted to have a real flexible mixer. I have this utility section in the middle which has 4 distings in it, in addition to an erogenous tones levitate. So I've got all these offsets, attenuations, and different modules. Like one of the modulations I've been using is a Kermit dual LFO, which is brilliantly designed dual LFO. And I like to have cross-modulating LFOs so I don't just have repetitive wah, wah, wah. But part of the noise engineering aesthetic is that it has a lot of noise, which is cool. Excuse me, industrial music electronics, not noise engineering, industrial music electronics and Kermit Man. So I've got a disting right next to it to just put a simple slew on it to take as much noise out or leave as much noise as I want to. I've got all these logic modules up here and trigger delays because I needed to build a system for this patch where that when I stopped the sequence, even though the clock was still running, those notes would stop happening. And the only way I could pull that off was through a combination of a trigger delay and some logic modules to say, mute those gates when no more triggers are coming out of my sequencer. So these utility modules are the secret to getting more subtlety and more complexity out of your voices rather than just sounding like an SH01.
Yeah. And I think that the right utilities would probably stop, certainly they have me as my utility section's grown, would stop people selling things so much. Because when a module doesn't necessarily just do what you want it to do, or maybe the peak of an envelope won't fully open your filter, or having the right utilities to make it do what you want and scale it for the rest of your system and your approach.
Yeah, it's a very simple thing here. Like I want the filter to have more of a bite, so I'm taking my filter output, running through one channel of the levitate just to amplify it beyond ×1, just to get that much harder of a spike to go ahead and hit the cutoff frequency of the evolution. Just things like that I'd either have to compromise my voice, or I could say, you know what, I really want this voice to do, then utilities will make me do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I've completely just lost my train of thought there. I had a really good question for the next bit. But scanning around the kind of, how do you start with this thing? You know, stylistically, music-wise, are you trying to do everything with this in terms of now you've got some drums in there? Is it playing a whole thing? Like you said, once the sequencing stops, the drums stop? Or what's the kind of approach? Is it today I'm going to make a piece of music on the modular, or is it I'm just going to explore sounds? You know, tomorrow morning you've got some time off, you want to turn the system on, what's likely to happen?
I'm going to explore sounds. That's the reason this machine exists for me, is to explore new sounds that I've not heard before, to come up with brand new sounds. To me, that's the whole reason to get into synthesizers, is to make a sound you haven't heard before, and then perhaps use it in a musical context. So I do have a longer term plan to use this as a compositional and eventually a live performance tool. But the past year and the next year are still going to be focused on how do I come up with a new vocabulary of sounds that I haven't heard before that I find interesting and I can use in my music. So I just started a patch literally with the VCO section and plug the VCO straight into the output modules and start coming up with, well, what waves do I feel like using today? Some FM maybe. Oh, then maybe we put that through the wave folder, and I'll just start building the voice step by step, all going directly to the output module all the while, until eventually, the VCA is practically the last thing that I add, because I'm working on, let's build really interesting timbres, let's modify the timbres, etc.
That tends to be my first patch cable as well, is output to, well, if I know I want something quick and rhythmic and it's a snappy VCA, it will be output to the VCA, then something into it and an envelope or trigger to make that happen. And then I move the output cable along. I tend to start with a really long, one of these glowing expert sleepers cables, and then that moves around. So VCO first maybe, then into a folder. So then I patch the VCO into the folder, and I follow the output cable around, and it's big enough that I can kind of angle up across the system. It's interesting that you go about that as well. What I was going to say, sorry, was about complex oscillators. But just before that, Guido's brought up, just to repeat a question from above from Jimmy Way. He's heard that you're not a big fan of maths. Is this true? And if so, how come? I don't have a maths. I'll throw in before you start. I still don't have a maths. I've never had a maths.
Okay. Maths is brilliant.
Yes.
Okay. I'm not anti-maths. Anyone who does not have a large system, who is wanting to really open up the possibilities in their system, a maths is a great module. So I'm not anti-maths. It just so happens that I have the components of a maths several times over already in my system. These two guys up here, which I should start using more than I do, these are a couple of modules from the 70s called Dennis Electronics control voltage processors. And they have slews, input mixers, rectifiers, Schmitt triggers, virtually all the stuff you see in a maths just doesn't have the end of gate triggers, although it does have Schmitt triggers and things like that. So I've had a pair of maths since day one. So that's why I don't have a maths. My other quibble with the maths, and this is a personal thing, is the attack envelope shape. I personally like, if I'm going to have a slow attack, a logarithmic shape to it. Maths is one of those devices that has an exponential shape to it. It's perfectly useful for some sounds, not the type of sounds I make most often. So that's why it's not my first choice to have as an additional envelope generator in my system.
Yeah, it's a shared shape control. So you can't have a log attack or a log rise and an exponential decay. Very much the same reason as me. I've got maths functions, God knows how many times over, between this and other things down here and behind me. And so I kind of don't feel that I need it. And I watched every single thing I could find when I got into this, which kind of 5 years-ish back was nothing like it is now, with me and you making videos and other people making great content as well. But I watched every single thing I could find and very much got into utilities early on. That said, when I go to someone else's and they have a maths, it becomes a hub for me of, well, I know I've got offsets, I know I've got attenuators, I know I've at least got 2 envelopes or an LFO and an envelope. And it does become this amazing hub to patch out of when I'm kind of staring into the abyss of someone else's idea of a system and I've no idea what's going on. So it is very, very useful. And
also, I will say that I don't have a maths, but I did recently get a surge clone dual universal slope generator, which is another predecessor to maths, mainly because I want to learn more about what the surge approach is. I've very comfortable with the Moog approach. I'm very comfortable with the Buchler approach. Now I'm trying to get some more of the surge philosophy into my head. So I made a point of getting a couple surge clone modules just to say what's in that world that I can add to what I'm doing. So I do have maths-like functions. And if I didn't have this, or if I was restricted to say 2 rows, a mass is a great module to have. I have that one minor quibble about using it as an envelope generator, but a lot of us are doing percussive stuff anyway and have a fast attack. We'll never hear the attack envelope shape. So I'm not anti-mass. I have its functions many times over, and I wish, by the way, that they had a logarithmic attack for the slew up.
Yeah, same for me. I'm not anti-mass in any way, and in anyone else's system where there is one, I do tend to go and use it. I would be anti not having those functions, and I think it's the perfect way of getting them all in when you're starting out or having that in the travel system. Guido's brought up an interesting point. Same for Rampage as well, the Bufacco Rampage. That's a shared shape control. I do like that. I mean, I do like maths. I just don't have one. I think, I don't know what it is, but yeah, that would be the same for you. That's a shared shape control over both. Although that might actually have, let me pull an image up for that. Maybe that's why I tend to gravitate towards it, when it would have to be one over the other. If I can find a good enough image. Yes, it does. There we go. Perfect. Here we go, Guido. Here's the answer to that one. If you look at the shape control, the 2 white knobs, it's completely linear like a triangle at the top, but then to the left, it's an expo decay and a log. An expo rise and a log fall. It's a logarithmic rise and an exponential fall the other way. So no, it will, but again, you can't control both independently like you could on, say, a WMD envelope. But they are the opposite to each other. And maybe that's why I tended to gravitate that way for myself. It probably is.
And that attack shape is one. I try to be a mellow person. You know, I lived in California for ages, et cetera, et cetera. But that's one thing that'll get me off is an attack shape, is when a manufacturer didn't think through the attack shape. And I see some manufacturers put on their modules the exponential attack without thinking it through, or because, oh, it's a tribute to the original Buchla. You know, Don Buchla and Bob Moog and Serge Cherpin are brilliant people, but they're not gods with stone tablets. They didn't do it right the first time. Even they changed things later on in their systems. So let's learn, rather than doing these tribute modules of, well, the Buchla 100 module had that shape, but well, maybe we found that we like this shape as much or better. And I wish more manufacturers would think through choices in a musical context rather than just saying, well, it's exponential. Well, that's what that had. And that's the one thing that will get me off, is particularly when I go to a booth and say, what's your attack shape? That tells me whether or not they thought things through.
That's interesting. The kind of killer question for the trade show floor. We touched, well, complex oscillators got brought up, and that's something
complex oscillators, yes.
What I wanted to touch on. There are some other questions that I will definitely come to as well, in terms of sequencing, from Ola in the comments. But complex oscillators, what's your choice? If you had to have one?
Well, that's the funny thing. There is a limited amount of space. Here, 7 rows, 197 HP. There's a limited amount of space in my system. But because of my choice in other modules, I'm trying to keep myself to one complex oscillator. And I haven't found the one yet. I've used a Verbose for a while. Excellent sound to it. It has a particular guttural sound that I particularly like. It's optimized for sub-audio rate modulation, like vibrato and tremolo. Personally, I like frequency modulation. And personally, I like linear frequency modulation. And a lot of the complex oscillators have exponential frequency modulation instead. I've been playing around with the Pittsburgh Lifeforms dual helix. I like that module. I should not like it, because being an engineer in German and Virgo and all this jazz, it's got all sorts of strange things in terms of intermodulation going on. Yeah, it's exponential FM. It's not linear. It doesn't have a wave. Well, it has an excellent wave shaper in it, but it has their own low-pass gate in it, which is kind of unusual to build into a complex oscillator. But it just sounds good. I really like the sounds I get out of the Pittsburgh double helix. I've started playing around with the radical frequencies dual precision. It's a dual VCO more than a complex oscillator. It has lots of internal patching for FM, but it doesn't have a wave shaper or a full wave rectifier built into it. But I'm just getting my head wrapped around this module, and there's lots of possibilities. It has a non-standard sync circuit. You can have both linear and exponential FM at the same time, It does not have any VCAs built into it. So when you want to envelope the modulation depth, you have to go outside and patch. So it's its own beast. Someone's loaning me a further generator, and I've got a hold of both the original non-through zero core and the through zero core. I'm really looking forward to playing with that next month to see what that module sounds like, and does that hit my sound. So far, my favorite complex oscillator has been patching together multiple oscillators and using my own wave shapers.
Just to bring it up with quantum space, I remember someone did ask me this. He says, I'm the guy that wanted you to make a video comparing all the various complex oscillators. If everyone that makes one wants to send me one, then and I'm sure Chris would do the same. I'd like to see Chris do it. I'd like to do it myself, but it's not really a feasible thing. And I think to ask, I can't speak of anyone personally because I've not tried, but I think if I would, to email the manufacturers, Chris, probably the same experience, and say, I'm going to put you up against all the other options in class. Can I borrow it for a while and see? I don't think they'd all send one. And not because any one of them is bad, but just if I had any kind of element of personal taste or favoritism, or I find they all speak to everyone differently, the complex oscillators.
Yeah, there's going to be different tastes. I can't say what's the best one. I can tell you what one I prefer for my music and my ears. But what I'm trying to do when I do module videos is I'm trying not to put my personal taste too much into them. I'm trying to say, look, here's what this can do, and here's how to access these sounds in it. Now you decide if that's appropriate for your music. Now I've got some biases, but that's the idea. Is I want people to make their own music instead of trying to copy what someone else does.
Same for me. I think my taste and bias would come across in the patches that I choose to demo with, but this is why I don't want to give it a score out of 10. I don't want to compare it, like a magazine style review. I don't want to say for £400 you could also get this or this, and maybe this is better for this reason. And there is no best. Not that anyone's asked what's the best. Me and Matthew Shaw talk about this one a lot, that I do modular podcasts with, that when people say, what's the best X, what's the best Y, what's the best Z? Well, I don't think there is a kind of definitive best of many of these types of modules. And as months go by, I've tended to favor different complex oscillators. I've had the Sputnik, which is excellent. Very much enjoyed the Sputnik. But I've settled on the feedback modules. They're 259 VCO. They come separate, two 259 style VCOs, and then a shaper that they expand into the back with headers on the back. That's the one particularly speaking to my ears. I've had great fun with a DPO. I've not used the further generator, so it'll be interesting to hear what you say. On that one.
Actually, if I can just wrap up a little bit on complex oscillators. Honestly, one of my favorite complex oscillators, some of you will laugh at this because some of these modules get put down, is I like to use the fold section of the braids, put that through a VCA into the linear FM sine wave on an Expert Sleeper's disting, and then take that into a wave folder. I personally like the wave multipliers, the surge wave multipliers for sine and triangle waves. If I'm folding a sawtooth wave, I'll use the STG wave folder instead. That's actually been my favorite complex oscillator in terms of getting to that sound that I associate with that plucked linear FM wave-folded sound, is to patch braids and fold mode through a VCA enveloped to sine wave on a disting, and then maybe to a separate wave folder. That's what I like.
Sorry, I got Quantum Space's question completely wrong. Someone did ask me, though, sorry it wasn't you, about comparing things. We'll come to that in 1 second. It's funny you mentioned the fold mode on braids. Lots of people that are quick to stamp down on braids that, it's only got 2 modulation inputs. How many modulation inputs does your analog oscillator have? Pulse width, and that's maybe it. There's obviously FM as well, but braids also has FM and pitch, and the trigger that can be used as like a sync input on an analog style oscillator. But that fold mode on braids tends to be what I reach to if I'm demoing something else and I need a quick synth sound. And it's the one that everyone says, that bass line sounded really cool, what was that? And they're always shocked when it's the fold mode on braids.
It's one of the secrets in there, yeah.
Yeah, really, really well thought out. What Quantum Space actually asked was, he wants to use the modules he has to build a complex oscillator.
Ah, well, I just answered that then, didn't I?
Yeah, I just said that Chris has answered that. You want two oscillators and the shaping. Effectively, if you look at the DPO or the Verbos, there are two oscillators. There's a modulation bus that would offer AM modulation, so VCA, timbre modulation, usually a wave folder, sometimes different shaping, and FM. And that's effective.
And a personal taste, and this is personal again, is I personally prefer linear FM, and virtually every oscillator has exponential FM. Only a few have linear FM. They have to be marked as having that, because it allows me to stay in tune across the keyboard, to have some modulation in the sound if we're to stay tuned as I play up and down the keyboard. Exponential, if you're enveloping it, you can get out of tune with it. Exponential FM is wonderful in a static sense. I'll use exponential FM with one oscillator driving another, but no modulation, no VCA in between them, and come up with some really great, powerful, throaty sounds. But if I want to envelope that modulation depth, and I do because I like pluck sounds, I like horn blips, things like that, then it's got to have linear FM, so it's something to look for.
That's the thing that I wanted to kind of end on with complex oscillators, that it drives me insane. If you've got more than one layer going on, as we've said about polyphonic sequences overlapping, and I start to ride the depth of exponential FM, and that pitch of the carrying oscillator starts to rise and go out of tune, I'm like a kid throwing the toys out of the cot. I want to turn the system off and go away. Like, it really does wind me up. So I tend to go digital in that particular sense, kind of sequenced, more traditional Western music. I tend to go for kind of Yamaha operator style FM and look at that as my way of doing it. Linear FM, as you said, for kind of the softer sounds, but if I really want that harsh FM, I have to go digital if it's going to be kind of performed or even just extensively kind of played with by hand. So I tend to go digital. I should maybe hide under the desk. I'm sure some purists will not be happy with that.
Well, the funny thing is that's like the one place that I have a real bias, because I worked for sequential circuits for a while, and then later Roland, and Yamaha was like a mortal enemy back then. But also because the DX7 like killed the market for so many of us, so I've always held that grudge, never ending against Yamaha. So that's why you won't see me with an Akamai's Castle or something like that.
Yeah, fair enough. It pulled your livelihood away.
Says the person who has a bass limiter toss the FM-based percussion module. So,
yeah, I tend to personally, and maybe you'll like this if you don't like Yamaha or didn't back then, I tend to prefer the Casio CZ phase distortion, where you can't change the pitch of the modulation. It's all at the same pitch, which is like the WMD PDO. I find that
always
fantastic.
Surprised with how analogish the CZ101 played from the very first day I played it.
Yeah, and the WMPDO is a real kind of hidden, amazing. It's 4 oscillators, all at the same pitch. You can change their waveforms, but then they will all audio rate phase distort. I think phase distortion is the term when it doesn't. You can't repitch them. It's phase modulation in the DX7, and they can be different pitches, and it's potentially wider ranging.
There's some things about the tuning ratio and how deep the depth is and stuff like that to get around the Yamaha patent, basically.
Yeah. As you mentioned a little bit of your kind of synth history, Peter Freeman asked earlier on, and thanks for bringing that back up, Peter. I've just seen it. What are your thoughts on modular versus external sequencers, given the limitations of modular sequencers? I'll touch on limitations of modular sequences after you've gone.
There's not one answer to that question.
No.
Yes, external sequencers are very cool. And I like the aesthetic of a modular sequencer because, again, it's part of my interactive performance to go up to it and manipulate it and to change what's going on. That's why I have a René, and that's why I love the multiple voltage rows on the Doepfer, so I can do things like choose my ratcheting depth right here on the knobs. That said, this space right here, this is reserved for a 512 vector sequencer. 512 is the folks who do a software sequencer, numerology, which is extremely powerful. And he's doing numerology and then some in a module that will also interface with the computer. It will also have MIDI outputs to drive your other keyboards in addition to your modular system. And I played a little bit with the pre-beta, and the things you can do per stage in it are just stunning. So I think that's going to be the answer for limitations. What limitations when that finally comes out?
Yeah. my sequencer of choice, until it went for reasons I won't get into, it wasn't a case of I didn't like it. The Audio Damage Sequencer 1 was great for that, because you had 3 additional CVs per step. There's 2 CVs to come back in and influence it, and you could attenuate onboard LFOs and just have an LFO or stepped random, just maybe every bar there's a new stepped random value, heavily attenuated, would just influence transposition, and there was quantizing, so the whole sequence didn't just budge up and down, it would then reshape itself into the scale. That was great. But things like the Zeta Ohm Fluxus 1, that's crazy. There's an arpeggiator per step that can be on or off, and then at different note lengths and rates. So maybe step 3's got some 16th note arpeggiator that plays for a quarter note, and it doesn't seem limited at all. And I think it being in a different format, because ultimately being able to pencil MIDI into an Ableton Live clip or MIDI in Logic or Cubase is probably the quickest if you've a very, you know exactly what notes and at what lengths, and the pitch bend to be and all their velocities. That will give you an exact thing the same every time. But I find these more complex sequences, things like a Stilson Hammer, or even the Orthogonal Devices ER101, people are doing amazing things with those. I know VCO ADSR, techno artist performing with Eurorack, there's 2 of those now, and they're expanders, and that runs his whole rig. And it doesn't seem limited at all. His imagination seems to be the only limit.
The trade-off, of course, is the user interface and how easy it is to access those features. And yeah. I come from a background of, I use live in scene mode where I improvise live, playing around with what loops are playing at any given time and chaining things together. And that's the same thing I want with the sequencers. I want something that's fairly shallow so I can go in and change things rather than just going from part A to part B to part C and having to pre-program everything. That's one of the things I like about the 512 vector sequencers. There's a row of rotary encoders, and it's been fairly easy so far in the pre-beta unit to pull up a parameter and start changing individual steps. So I'm excited about that being something with a lot of depth, but shallow to use in a live performance context.
Yeah. Still just working down the questions. Peter Freeman asks, does your design work experience on the Prophet VS influence your approach to oscillators in modular?
Probably not, to be completely honest. Well, let me think about that. The idea of the Prophet VS and vector synthesis is that we had been working on your typical East Coast 2 VCO, and in unfortunate cases, 1 VCO instruments is sequential. And then we built a sampler. And suddenly we were introduced to what real sounds did as opposed to synthesized sounds. So we were hearing all this motion and evolution inside sustained notes, or even after the attacks, as opposed to just sustaining a note on a typical East Coast keyboard synthesizer. So that's what really informed the Prophet VS, is we wanted a way to keep the sound evolving while you're holding down a note. And we wanted a way to have a complex evolution of the sound on the attacks. So that's why it had the 4 oscillators laid out as the grid, was we wanted to be able to do this dynamic mix between those oscillators, so you never just hit sustain and there you were. We wanted that sound to keep moving, or we wanted to have a complex attack through different timbres of the different oscillators to create these more complex attacks that we were hearing in sampled sounds. In terms of that search for constantly evolving sounds, that definitely has informed the way that I patch my modular. And in particular, I have been getting more and more away from even using simple LFOs, because I don't even want a repetitive LFO. I've been getting more into random sources like the Sapel from Frap Tools. I like the Kermit, which is a dual LFO, because one LFO can modulate the other LFO, so I can create this complex evolving sound. I've got a Chakwa for more chaos theory in my machine. I want that constantly evolving, non-repetitive sound, non-machine-like sound. So that does inform it. I'm a little disappointed that there has not been a modular oscillator yet that recreated what we did with the Prophet VS. There's all sorts of nice wavetable stuff, but a lot of it's based on the manufacturer chooses the wavetables, and then you get to crossfade between what they chose. And the idea of the Prophet VS was you got to choose what one of those 4 corners, and then you got to choose the path in between them. And hasn't really been a module that does that. A lot of decisions are made for you ahead of time. So that's one of the things I was kind of wish was in a modular synth that might be coming with the Percussa complex VCO that's coming out. I've talked to him about that idea. And there's a couple other things that were on paper that didn't make it into the VS or on paper for a synth that never came to be when I was working at Roland. I still would like to see modules. I've got some ideas for complex envelopes and stuff that if there's a manufacturer who wants to team up, I'm done being a manufacturer. I'm not going to build this stuff. I'm a user now. But there's some ideas I still like to see get out there.
Yeah. Will the flame, is it the 4-vox? Will that let you do that?
Yeah,
each
with external
is 4, and I don't know if you'd need a
put in
based switching, or if it actually does it. I don't know if it will kind of scan between its own 4 oscillators to.
I think if you take a 4-vox and you put it into an IntelliGel planar, you'd have it.
Yeah. The planar would do it. Yeah. David Primer mentioned as both using the Mordax data and it being one of the first things he's used, and he's surprised he doesn't see more people use it. Wanted to talk about the kind of visual aspect. I didn't have data for a long time. It wasn't out in my system. The O-tool was, which looked great, but I never kind of jumped at it. I don't think I was hindered by not having one, but visualizing things certainly. Well, it helped. I guess it did help. I was going to say it wasn't that important, potentially, because I'd had the system long enough by then. But what would you say as to, I guess, using an oscilloscope of any kind in general?
I think that something like a data or an oscilloscope is a really useful tool to understand what your machine is doing. And some of these modules, you don't know what's going in and out or why they're acting the way that they are. And I found the data has just been invaluable for me to go, oh, that's what it's doing. Whether it's an envelope shape or the way that a wave folder is working or the way that overdriving a filter is actually changing the wave shape. Is it canceling out the resonance? Does it make the resonance go crazy? So that's why I use a data like in area one of my videos and on all my courses on learning modular. And I just ran into that recently. We're going like, the data's over in the teaching rack and it's not in here. And just last night I said, I think the next module's got to be a data for this as well. So now I'm deciding which module to kick out to make room for it. Because I was playing around with the dual precision VCO, which was doing some things different than other oscillators. I said, I really have to understand what this is doing. So just using my ears and going, I think it's doing that. I really want to visualize on the data. So that's one of the things going to get added to this beast soon. I already have it in my teaching machine, of course.
Yeah. Someone's asked data versus O-tool too. Are we completely straight? Mordax were kind enough to send me a prototype for a course. That was the decision at the time that was the one that's coming. But I think data, it's 4 channels, which I find really useful. If I'm modulating, I've just done a video with the Rebel Technology mix series that I'm currently editing. And I used the left and right stereo mixing for CV. So I had 2 envelopes and then 2 sample and hold running at different rates. And I'm using the pan to kind of crossfade and blend between left and right, and used all 4 blended in different amounts to 2 different filters for a stereo voice. Being able to show all 4 things at once is pretty amazing, really. I guess smaller, but I don't want to kind of restrict. My eyesight's not fantastic either, to be fair. So the data's bigger screen is definitely for me. And the other things it does, I know O-tool does other things as well, but voltage references, the clock they do is a really stable, tempo accurate clock that you can CV divisions of. You can kind of ratchet the clocks in there. I then get a little bit again like a kid throwing toys out of the cot, that I then don't have the oscilloscope because I'm using the clock mode. Or the tuner's great as well. Yeah, data for me.
Both data and O-tool have a lot of additional features. I think the O-tool even has like a Euclidean sequencer in it now. And there's all these voltage sources and things like that out of the data. I use the scope display 99% of the time. And for me, it's having the 4 traces, because a lot of the time you just need 2 traces input to output to see what's going on. But there's been a lot of cases where I've needed to see 3 or 4, particularly when I've got complex envelopes or random voltages going on, or I have multiple waveforms I'm mixing together. I've needed at least 3, and that's what trips it over for me for the data, is being able to, again, the idea of the system is not to say, sorry, you can't do that. I've been building my system based on, I want to do whatever I can imagine. The data is one of those things that just don't restrict me.
Yeah. Quantum Space has asked, why don't you work between the monster case and your other rack? I'll answer that one as well, but you go first, Chris.
They're just different mindsets. The little case over here, which has become the video case, is on the one hand really set up for the cameras right there. I normally have the light set up for it. It's pre-configured with all the support modules that I need. And it's become my homework case. When I get a new module in and I want to learn how it works, the only way that the most efficient way for me to do it is to put it in this little case with focused, limited options, and then just really learn that module. Then I can put into the big system, start using it. So this, to me, is work and study, and this, for me, is play. And it's a big psychological shift for me as to which one I'm using and why.
Yeah, very much the same for me as well. That my cases, they're all over at the minute. There are other cases around. I'm not going to pan camera around and move around the room. The video case, and I imagine you're the same, Chris, it gets pulled to pieces regularly. Something comes in, and my mindset in that moment is, this is 12 HP, where's their 12 HP, and where can I put the data next to it so other people can see what's going on, and I just pull it out. It tends to be around this kind of bottom-ish area, and I have a little bit of support around in terms of mixing and basic voices, so I feel like I can do most of what I would want to do. I feel like each case is building an instrument, though. There's a few modular podcast videos where we talk about this. Matthew Shaw's a big advocate of each case being a separate thing. So you might have a all digital pad drone system. There might then be a rhythm case. There might then be something else. This bottom 6U, which is 2 tip-top hex happy ending kits, just in a really basic MDF box. That's been my drum machine for a long time. And that's how I want to go about resetting up this system. That is my particular instrument. And Nathan Moody approached this as well. I've just been listening to his Red Box album that's coming out soon, and his Blue Box. And he puts a system together, and that is that moment in time. That is his instrument. And for me, that's really where I'm kind of at musically with it at the minute. So I don't tend to like, this is all one big mess, but cases outside of this, I don't particularly like cross-patching too much.
This is probably one part where you and I differ slightly, is that the video case for me is purposely limited and stable. It always has the same modules in it, except for one gap that the module under test goes into.
Right.
What varies for me, though, is when I travel, and we prefer to travel by driving, and we take the SUV out, is I build myself a 1-row 84, 85 HP case for that trip, and it has a theme to it. And I will put together a collection of modules, sometimes ones I want to learn, but because I want to explore a theme or an approach to making music. So that's going to be my companion for the next week or two.
Yeah. Dissonance just said he has a performance case and a studio case, and the performance case is fairly static and changes very little.
But in terms of patching between them, you need to start pulling out the 6-foot cables if I'm going to make it from this, over to something on this. And it's just not practical. So that was another choice for me for this case, was what's something that's ergonomic, that's in front of me in my field of vision. That's my instrument. And then I don't even cross patch over to these guys as much as I should, just because I'm focused on this is the instrument.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've mentioned that's potentially your live instrument. I guess you're heavily restricted in terms of where you're going to perform. Although Colin Benders takes a huge system out. Maybe that's another video, how to travel with a huge rig. I think he trained his whole rig over for the first Super Booth. I don't know how he managed to box it up. I don't think it was all flight cased, or maybe it was. Yeah, that's.
I'm looking at venues in town. Like we have a very, very cool installation up north in Santa Fe called Meow Wolf. That is this immersive environment. It's a building that you go into, and every room has something new to explore, and there's a storyline for the whole building. It's a very cool installation. But in the middle of it, they have a performance stage, and they have bands in there. They also have a school section adjacent to it where the person who does sound design for Meow Wolf teaches Ableton Live classes, etc. So I really have in my mind that places like Meow Wolf with a dedicated stage where it's an event to go do something, something where I really want to take this out and go play. Also, one of my sidelines is I also create art, and there's always the thing of like, well, what can you do for your art opening to make it interesting? Can you have any ambient music? I'm thinking about bringing the modular one day for one of my art openings.
Yeah, that'd be really cool. It goes hand in hand, I think, with the idea of installations. For people that are on my Patreon page and Chris's Patreon page that support us doing these kind of things, we did a Patreon-only live chat a couple of weeks ago, and Edward Ball came on, great abstract painter. There's a lot of live throwing paint around, impressive work, and he was talking about that. He's looking at getting into the sound and the modular being part of this whole artistic piece, and that's part of the presentation. I think it works. It goes hand in hand, very much so. What are you doing for effects? If this is your big, this is my sonic tool, this is my playground, are you, again, like you were in terms of patching most of it around the oscillators and filters rather than the VCA kind of output of each voice? Is that where most of the kind of harmonic coloration's going on, or are you really heavily relying on effects?
I surprise myself how little I've used effects on this system. For me, a lot of it is in the patch. The harmonic movement is in the patch. Even faking reverb tails for me is tailoring envelopes with, having sustain and then having that long, slow release is my reverb tail when I'm creating patches. That said, I'm reworking my effects section down here. I have a Roland Demora delay just because it's so flexible. It's digital. I know people hate digital, but it's better for what I like to do than like the Roland 578 I have here, which is a recreation, Roland 572, which is a recreation of the old Roland System 100, 172. It's got a phaser, which is fun, voltage controlled. It has a chorus unit. But I'm going to replace this with the new AGH 12-stage phaser. I have a clouds, because I was playing around with convolving sounds and doing that sort of sound modeling with funk and sound hack back in the 90s, I guess. And then I'm going to put in the new AGH finisher module, which has EQ and reverb. I do like having a room to set everything into. And one thing I've not been using much is reverb in my external rack over there. So I'm hoping that having a reverb built in this will just help finish off having a room to put all those voices into. But for me, the vast majority of that motion and even things like the reverb tails and ambience is in the patch.
Yeah. Well, that's how claps that have, like the mutant clap from Hex Inverter, it has a fake reverb, which is the same noise from the clap and a release stage, but it's filtered down. So you can just have a darker release that kind of very primitively, you can do it nicer with synth waves and noise, I think, but very primitively creates space. But it works. It makes that clap feel like it's in a kind of fake room hall, and it kind of sits amongst electronic drums really well. Let's have a look at the kind of drum section. It sounds like the use is very kind of synth heavy, layering voices. How are drums sitting in? Is that kind of an afterthought in terms of your approach? Is that the kind of last bit, or do you some days want to start with drums?
It's been very much a late addition because I wanted to do everything with sequences, and I imagined that I'd be using Ableton Live for my percussion parts. But what's really kind of drawn me to adding a percussion section to this is having that synthetic deep, tight sound as one of my layers, like a really just deep kick drum and things like that I can go ahead and patch and make part of the system rather than having to burn a whole loop in Ableton Live. And I've also been really getting into algorithmic rhythm generators. Like I have a Shackmat Night Scallop and a Mutual Instruments Grids, and I just did videos on both of those recently. Because I
say people should go watch the videos you've done for those.
Yeah, video manuals I've done for these more or less. Because not only do I want them to drive my percussion sounds, and I'll talk about what modules I have in a second, I'm wanting to explore using these also to drive accents and even drive the sequencers as well. So rather than having the perfectly repetitive, everything on eighth note sequence that we're used to from Tangerine Dream, etc. I want to have staggered and stuttering, but in a musical rhythmic sense, sequences that tie in with the rest of the percussion lines, because I really like that combination of making something melodic part of the percussion line, something percussive part of the melodic line, and blending those parts rather than really separating them out. But otherwise, this percussion section is pretty simple. I have a Pico drums from Erica. I have the Bacillus Itertas from Noise Engineering. I have an EMW, a company out of Brazil, a noise station, which has the widest variety of noises I found, including a couple of those hi-hat so-called shimmer sounds, a number of fixed filters, as well as controllable filters, and then a dual low-pass gate. I've got the Make Noise LXD because it's small is part of the reason, but also it has different stages. It has a 6 dB stage with a more generous tail to it, and a 12 dB stage that's a bit tighter to process the noise, but also to tighten up what's coming out of the BI module. And then I decided just recently to give this section its own mixer because it became too crazy draping cables down over everybody else to get them into the output. So I've added a verbose electronic scan and pan here for a couple of reasons. One, stereo mixer, voltage control over both level and panning, so I can have things moving around, but also has a really nice input stage where unity is just at 9 o'clock, and beyond that, it has a lovely rounded saturation. And I do like overdriven percussion sounds as one of my things, aesthetics that I do. And this gives me a chance to really get that lovely, hot, compressed, overdriven sound at the mix stage.
Yeah, saturation and drums is just match made in heaven, definitely. So I just wanted to touch on, do you use many kind of dividers with the algorithmic rhythm stuff? I tend to use Euclidean rhythms when I'm driving other things with some sort of divider. The new Moffensief modular Mito looks great for that. But even just a simple 4MS RCD, purely because a clock multiplier is going to need 2 clock pulses or more for it to then digitally work out the tempo and then multiply it up. So it will always, when there's a drift in tempo, kind of recalculate and jitter up and down. It's not quite smooth. Whereas an analog style divider will just wait for, if it's the divide free, it will wait for 3 pulses, and that's the divide free, regardless of what the timing of these pulses is. And I find that really useful. Something like grids into a 4MS RCD, or the Chaos divider from Cylon Labs, if you can still find one, that's good. What's the kind of, what's downstream from that? Or do you think the Shackmat and grids is enough at the minute?
I prefer using these a little bit faster of an internal tempo and then really getting sparse on the beats, so I get little rolls as part of the rhythm anyway. But I do have a 4MS quad clock distributor, which has the multiply, but also the divide side. But I also have a logic section down here. Switches, I just recently got IntelliGel plug. And also, I'm looking at getting another logic device in here, but the plug in particular has flip-flops, which can act as dividers as well. So I'm doing, and I've added some other modules, like I've got a probability skipper from Lattic and things like that. So I do have in here a lot of dividers, a lot of chance-based stuff, and whether or not things get divided to one output or another output, because I like that chance element for fills as opposed to just always happening on the 3rd or 4th beat, etc. And that's been my section right now for doing that.
I find grids with using something like an octo controller, or having some step random, or like an ultra random analog even, or Pamela's new workout. The same with I've just done a video for Tuesday by This Is Not Rocket Science, and it's very much the melodic version of grids in terms of algorithmic melody generation. I love it. I find it so kind of inspiring and quick. And grids as well, I think people were frustrated that grids wouldn't effectively give them a kind of house and techno straight 4 to the floor, but that's just a clock and an offset to put the hi-hats in between, and a 2 and 4 snare and clap. You can do that so easily elsewhere. I'm glad grids doesn't waste time doing it.
I asked Olivier where that was in grids, and he denied its existence. It's like, no, that's not what you do with grids. I did find the 4 on the floor setting, though.
Yeah. Someone's changed it. Someone's gone into this all being open source. Someone did put a video up recently as well and kind of repurpose it for themselves.
But also what you're talking about, for example, the Lattic voltage, probability skipper has a voltage controlled input on it, where I can feed it like a random source and say, when my random source gets above a level, divert this to the other output, for example. So that would give me some of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Guido's just mentioned that you have a 1 HP module. Tiny little switches next to Knight's Gallop.
I have 3. They're not actually in the system right now because they're on their way. They didn't make it in time. I have 3 1H switches from Shank coming. So I can change some of the settings on the probability skipper. I can change the settings also on the 2 envelope generators I have from Lattic. And yeah, because I like to break out different options. And I'm running out of space. One of the oddities of this monster frame is that it's an odd number of HP wide, 197 HP. And I cannot tell you the number of times I've needed 1 more HP. So finding things like a 1 HP switch instead of the 2 HP switch I made for my filter, that's become essential. That's part of the game for me to cram in all the functionality that I can into here.
Yeah, I have an 85 HP case. So I know the feeling with that one. Well, it feels like a good kind of time. If people want to ask any more questions, I'd like to start wrapping it up. We can definitely do a part 2 in in a few months or something. It'd be really good to kind of touch on a few other things and also see where the rack is, how much that 512 sequencer affects everything.
Yeah, we haven't got into filters hardly at all. We haven't gotten to low pass gates hardly at all. So that's things that we can do next time. This big gap right here is for the new AGH dual SEM filter. So we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, we did say when someone said, how long is this going to be? You know, it'll be all night kind of thing. So it'd be nice to come back and certainly touch on the bits we haven't. And also touching, so I'm sure it's going to have changed. It would do if it was me, definitely. So we'll leave it up just for a couple of minutes. Anyone want to ask any final questions? This is your last chance. I'm aware there's a bit of a delay in the stream, so we'll hang on. Let's quickly just talk about low pass gates where we wait for the last few questions. Any personal kind of favorites? Is it something you reach too much with this kind of no-cost style approach, or do you tend to use VCAs instead?
I'm using low pass gates more and more. For example, if I'm patching modulation between a pair of oscillators to do an FM pair, I'm just as likely to put a low pass gate in between them instead of a VCA. So I can use a more complex wave for the modulating oscillator to get an even more complex attack, then let the filter and low pass gate go down to more sinusoidal type for the end of the modulation. And I also love them to follow percussion sounds on things that are just too noisy, because I'm from the frequency layering school where you need to make holes for each of your parts in your music. So using something that has some filtering in addition to volume control helps me get sounds out of the way and make room for another instrument. Yes. I like multiple low pass gates because, again, I'm picking them for different sounds. I have a Make Noise LXD, which is a true Vactor low pass gate with all of its foibles, including needing to strike it a few times before it warms up, it opens all the way. I've been a huge fan of the Pittsburgh dynamic impulse filter because it gives you a knob with control over that decay time. And we were talking about decay envelope shapes. A Vactor type shape is a case of a real hyper exponential decay. It doesn't have a very fat middle section. It drops off very quickly and has a long tail to it. And that's one of the characteristics of some percussion sounds, things that ring out. So the Vactor emulations are important to get that type of sound that you won't get out of a lot of envelope generators. And I'm playing around some other low-pass gates. I want to get in a Thomas White dual low-pass gate someday just to test it because it's supposed to be very similar to the Buchla, and I want to hear what that aesthetic's like. Yeah. I have a verbose amplitude and tone control here, which is it's almost like a low-pass gate in a suit and tie. It's so well designed. I think of it more as a filter. And I'm intensely interested in the new Rabbit Elephant natural gates because it looks like that has taken the idea of a gate and really said, how can we evolve it a bit further in terms of shaping the attack and playing with the release, getting away from being locked into what a Vactor will do and saying, let's take the philosophy of what a low-pass gate's supposed to do and then expand on that philosophy rather than just recreating what Don Buchla had in parts back in the 60s.
Yeah, I really like Mutable Instrument Streams in its low-pass gate mode. I think it was Exper, that's quite known around the Muffigler forum, did a shootout on low-pass gates, like a blind pick your favorite out for audio tests and lots of different audio to check out. Streams came up very high. I think it was first or second. It might have even been first, which sounds excellent. Natural gate, very much interested in as well. We'll kind of fire quickly through these last few questions before we wrap up. Favorite ratcheting module?
I have two, and that's kind of how the system is.
Yeah.
I have a Latic S210, which I really do love for ratcheting because it's both trigger-based and voltage control-based. It has a nice flexibility. The weakness of it is it can false trigger if I'm using it for trigger to change between the switches. So that's why I have a dual trigger delay in front of it to make sure I fatten out the pulse just long enough so it doesn't mistrigger. One of the things I want to play around with, and I have actually a prototype of the SMD version of this, is Student Thai Guy's switch, because he has multiple switched outputs. Not only do you have a trigger and a control voltage to select which 4 of your inputs go out, he has these preset 2, 3, and 4 input rotations. And I want to play around with that to create some interesting polyrhythms and stuff like that. So I go for the Latic S210 first. That's what I have in this patch right here. But I think that the Student Thai Guy switch, which I have not had a chance to really get into yet, is going to open new possibilities for traveling polyrhythmic type of rhythms. Yeah.
For me, molecular variegate, either the 8 plus if I'm using that or the 4, they're fantastic. You can have probability based ratcheting. You can have random over how many ratchets happen. So you could have a probability on a step at say 80%. So it's probably going to hit that step, but you might not get a gate at all. But then you can have a random range of just the 1 hit or a burst of 2 or 3 or 4 or any scalable amount. That's really controllable, really expressive. Or just a switch. I really like the ALM Boss bow tie, which is 8 inputs, or 8 inputs to 1 out, or 1 in to 8 outs, and just putting lots of different clock divisions and multiplications in.
You also liked the Erica, didn't you?
Yeah, the Erica sequential switch as well, or even just a DUT for A151, just a 4 to 1 or 1 to 4, very basic sequential switch. But not gating it regularly. I tend not to think, right, if I send enough gates in on step 2, this will always have the ratchet. I like sending, as you were saying, logic patterns or Euclidean rhythms in, so the where it lands is a bit more, it feels more random in terms of where it lands than it always just having in the same place.
And I'm using, by the way, a 4MS quad clock distributor to feed a lot of the inputs on my switches. But then saying you can start playing around with then is what's actually doing the switching.
Yeah. Greedo, thank you to everyone saying they've really enjoyed this. By the way, thanking me and Chris for this. It's a pleasure, and we'll definitely come back and do it again, because there's way more for us to touch on. Guido asks, how much are we into sequences, sequencing sequences?
I have not done a lot of it yet. I see myself getting more in that direction down the road because there's lots of really cool possibilities there. I still have a bit of a live improv aesthetic to what I do. So I kind of like having more control over making those decisions on when the parts change myself, rather than setting up a system that does it. I mean, I like long system type patches and drones and stuff like that as well. But just my own personal aesthetic, I played in a band for a few years in LA that every piece was improvised every night. So I'm just used to that presence of what's everyone else doing. I'll switch the parts rather than letting it just come up in the playlist. So that's why I haven't gotten to sequencing sequencers yet. But I see that happening down the road as I start going out as a solo person trying to play half-hour pieces.
Yeah. For me, it's pressure points and the analog memory expansions, which takes up a lot of space, but I've got an 8x8 grid that by control or using brains, usually heavily divided down, every 8 steps it will move 1 step on, but then there are 8 new voltages effectively preset shifting 8 other things in the patch. That tends to be my approach for that one. Another one from Guido, how much are we into sequencers, not normal use, using them as a complex envelope or a graphic oscillator? I haven't used it as a graphic oscillator outside showing that they can do that in demos before. I've kind of gone, you can clock it really fast, and look, you can draw the waves, and then I've never really gone back to that. What about you?
Yeah, I haven't really used them as oscillators. I know there's even oscillators out there where you can draw the waveform and stuff like that. And when we were developing the wave shapes for the Prophet VS, we had a piece of software that Josh Sheffield wrote called Hacker, where we could actually do the equivalent of that, where we could draw the waveform, the same as using the stages. I do play around sometimes, though, with using sequencers as complex modulation sources, as, again, part of my attempt to get beyond the tyranny of the triangle wave, is I want something more complex to the evolution than just repetitive up, down. And I have a whole rant, by the way, about sine waves versus triangle waves and LFOs. But one thing I don't have room right now is I have another sequencer, a little RYO voltage controlled sequencer that I like to use for those modulation capabilities. And I even showed using that in my first learning modular synthesis course of using sequencers as modulation. So something that's in my head, but it's been kind of pushed aside right now by trying other techniques.
Yeah. DB Paulan asked, what's the low pass gate primarily used for? I'll just quickly fly through these. It's usually a 6 dB per octave gentle low pass filter coupled with a VCA. In terms of whether the circuit does that or not, I can't tell you. I don't know the circuits, but you lose as level goes down, you're losing high end, and that's how a lot of more natural instruments work, acoustic instruments work. How a lot of natural sound works. If someone's very distant away, all the sibilants and the top end in their voice goes away, someone comes right up to a vocal, you get all that sibilants and all the air in the voice, and it sounds very close. So it's a very natural way to control sound.
Yeah, a lot of percussion sounds work that way, where the initial attack is the brightest and noisiest, and then the upper harmonics die away as the vibrations die down in the sound. So that's a large part of it. And there's a lot of reference to the Buchla bongo patch, and the idea is create a very complex, harmonically rich FM patch, feed it into a low-pass gate with a very short impulse, and then you'll get that right attack of hitting skin or hitting steel, and then it'll die away into just a vibrating membrane sort of sound. And the other thing that makes low-pass gates very popular is the earlier ones tended to be teamed up with Vactrols, light-sensitive resistors that had a particular characteristic that if you hit them with an impulse, they'd go up, but they wouldn't shut off immediately like just putting a trigger into a VCA. They would have a hyper exponential shape to the decay, which also had a very nice damp percussion sound. That's part of the magic of a low-pass gate. You can patch the equivalent using a VCA and a VCF. It would be even more flexible, but that's why people speak in hushed tones about low-pass gates.
Final question. We didn't really say what it was used for. How are you using, I can't speak at this point, the Waldorf NW1? What do you tend to reach for with that?
I am a fan of the really old PPG 2.2 and 2.3 sound. It was a sound I really liked ages ago, and it was one of the inspirations for doing the Prophet VS. So I got an NW1 because I wanted to have a PPG sound in my case. My wife Trish is also a synthesist. She loves the PPG sound as well, so that's why it's here. So I use it for that hard switched wave scanning type of sound. It does have vocal sounds, phonemes, words in it as well. I don't use it for that, but I did just buy synthesis technology 950, 951, not for the vocal synthesis, but because I found that looping and repeating some of the phonemes created some really cool textures. So I'm more into that textural approach for the voice section. Otherwise, this is old Thomas Dolby, the Fix, Edgar Froese stuntman sort of wave sequencing love that I got this for.
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's sign it off there and leave it there for questions. Please go check out learningmodular.com. There's a lot on there for free. You'll find the YouTube on there. There are paid courses that are brilliant. Speak to Chris. I'm giving away everyone's time but mine today. Go speak to these people. Ask them questions. There's a lot to be gained. Thanks for everyone in the chat as well. That's just learningmodular.com. Check out Chris on Patreon as well. Yeah,
Learning Modular on Patreon, Learning Modular on Facebook. And I'm really happy. I had the opportunity to learn this stuff ages ago, and I'm really happy to come back and just get a chance to share it with all the new users in particular, because I love this stuff. And but understanding how they work inside really helps you get more out of them. So that's why I'm happy to share and do stuff with Ben, etc.
Yeah, yeah. I'll plug my Patreon page as well. A few people messaged me after the last live stream and said, you never really pitch the Patreon page. You need to kind of fly the flag for that. It's potentially an income stream that keeps us doing what we're doing. And that's certainly kind of my driven goal at the minute. So I would say go check out patreon.com/DivKid. Go check out Chris's on /learning modular. Feel free to leave some comments. This video will go back online in a few days. We've both been recording audio direct, which is going to be far better than the stream I get through Google when I take this video down. So I'll mix that and put the video back up. Feel free to leave some comments. I'm sure Chris will have a look. I'll watch the comments as I do for everything. And thanks for joining us. It's been great to chat. And we will definitely touch base again in a couple of months and do a part 2.
Yeah, catch me after NAMM, because there might be some cool stuff there.
Yeah, we'll do that kind of good couple of months into the new year, where your system's entirely different.
It's very meditative changing modules out, as long as you don't get the magic smoke.
Yeah, yeah. Right, great. Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks for everyone in the chat room, and see you guys soon.
Take care.